going. We're kind of like stopping in the middle of points as we're getting through this big thing called the French Revolution over the course of, several days. Only 2 days left. So I hope you're excited to never hear me yap ever again. Since I don't teach June 3, none of you will be in my class again. This is your last couple of times to hear me just drone on and on and on and on. So I'll leave that whether that's good or bad to you. But we got 2 more days. So we left in the middle of a thought. Again, thinking about just how bad the French world has plummeted to in a post American Revolution world where France is deeply in debt, both due to the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. Some historical accidents like wheat harvests going poorly, resulting in bread prices skyrocketing and unemployment skyrocketing. Everything that Louis did, Louis XIV, all those debts finally being called. And life is terrible for the everyday French person in the late 1700s. So that's where we left off. A sad note, but something had to change in France. And this is where the phases of the French Revolution begin. Okay, so again, everything's terrible. That's a summary of last week's class. Everything's terrible. 50% of your budget, at the very least, is going just to buy bread. So something drastically has to change in France. So the first phase of the revolution then comes in the aftermath of all of these economic issues. Something has to change, and finally the king, Louis XVI at this point, Louis XVI, realizes that he has to make some changes or else things are going to explode in France. Okay, he doesn't have his head necessarily in the sand, maybe not fully in the sand at this point, and realizes that some things need to change in France for them to survive. And so in 1789, France calls, or the king pulls together essentially their version of Parliament, which is called the Estates General. So this is like their version of English Parliament, or maybe we could say their version of like our House of Representatives, called the Estates General. It has an ancient founding, so it's been around for a long time, but it has not been called since 1614. So to put that another way, the monarchs of France went 175 years? Is that the amount of time? In which they did not ask the Estates General their opinion about France for 175 years. So they had not called the Estates General in well over a century and a half. So that tells you how bad things have gotten and how much Louis in particular is kind of under pressure to finally make some changes in France. He's doing something that his 2 predecessors had not done and hadn't been done since the early 1600s by calling the Estates General. Now, the Estates General was, again, a legislative group that was supposed to represent all 3 estates of France. Right? So representatives from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd estates. And the goal in his calling of the Estates General at this point is to fix some of the revenue issues by creating new taxes. But again, as you remember from last week, taxes usually fall upon the 3rd estate. So I think going into this, the representatives of the 3rd estate who are elected, so the representatives are elected. I think the representatives of the 3rd estate, they go into it wanting more than just new taxes. They already pay a truckload of taxes. So not only do they want new taxes, but I think the 3rd estate wants more evened out taxes, right? Where the nobility has to pay more than they've been paying in the past, and maybe even the church should pay more than it's been paying in the past. And so it seems like the representatives of the 3rd estate recognize that they have significant leverage on the other 2 estates. Remember, they're like 98% of the population, the 3rd estate. And so the Estates General is pulled together. Louis's stated goal is to create new taxes. It seems like the Third Estate has some other ideas. The biggest problem about the Estates General is that it is not proportionately equal. Each estate essentially gets, it's almost like each estate at these represents 1/3 of the vote, and each estate gets to vote as a voting block. So let me try to describe it another way. When you came to the Estates General, the idea here is that yes, you have representatives of each estate, but each estate gets 1 vote at the end of the day to make, 3 votes total of the first, second, and third estates. Hold on one second, Gene, I'll come back. Which means that the first and second estates could always gang up on the third estate in the voting process. So again, even though the third estate, the everyday people, is 98% of the population, in the Estates General, they only represented 1 out of 3 votes. And the other 2 also got 1 vote. The first and the second estates, which meant that no matter what they were trying to pass, the first and second estates could gang up on the third estate to ensure that no new or extra taxes were placed on them. Does that make sense? Gee, you have a question. Are you sure? Okay. Yeah, it's like a collective vote. Yep, exactly. Yes.
I was wondering how many, is there obviously the third state that have
Yeah.
Is there more representatives for the third state than we look at one voter?
Yes, there are more representatives of the third estate, and then collectively they get 1 vote. And this is going to come into play in just a second. So pause on that for a second, and then they realize that and want to leverage that. Yeah. Yeah. California and Kansas both have two senators. Yeah, even though Kansas is like 500,000 population or something, and California is 30 million or something. Yeah. So it's a disproportionate representation. The only difference is that we also then have the House of Representatives that's supposed to balance that out. They don't have that. This is the only representation, and it's balanced towards the first and second estates. Yeah. Good question. So again, he calls the estates, but based upon kind of this medieval view, each estate gets 1 vote, and they can vote collectively, which usually meant that the first and second estates always voted against the third estates. Whatever the third estate wanted, the other 2 could gang up and essentially quash whatever the whatever the third estate wanted, the most people, right? Now, though, with things getting so bad and the leverage is clearly there, the third estate asks for some concessions. In other words, they essentially say, we are not going to put up with this type of voting any longer. So that's what I mean by they object. The third estate says, we're willing to come to the Estates General, but something has to change. We will not allow this to happen. And one of the things that the third estate asks for is that they want essentially individual votes. This is what your question was a little bit about. I'm trying to this idea that now they want essentially to say, we have more representatives. Let's do like the House of Representatives does and just say each person is 1 vote, and then we'll add up the votes. Right? The first and second estate do not want that because they are widely outnumbered. The king also doesn't want that because the king's the king, and he doesn't care what the everyday people think. He just wants to get out of this problem. So the first thing they ask for is individual votes. The king rejects this proposal. No, you may not have individual votes. That will obviously tip it in the direction of the everyday third estate people. So then they ask, and the king does allow for this in a second, I'll describe this a little bit, something called doubling the third. Which means instead of an individual vote, now the third estate's votes count as 2 votes, and the first and second estate counts as only 1 vote apiece. so that essentially you could have a stalemate. Does that make sense? So under the old system, each estate only gets one vote. In doubling of the third estate now gets 2 votes, and the other 2 estates still only get their 1 vote. So you could have a 2-2 tie. Yeah. Does that make sense? I know it's a little convoluted, but does that make sense? You can ask questions if you're like, actually, that doesn't make sense in 5 minutes. Ask a question. At first, the king doesn't want this, and this is a big mistake on the king's part. So I summarize this as the king waffles on this. The idea of waffling is when a politician says one thing, then changes their mind, and then changes their mind again, right? That's called waffling. Like they don't have any principles, right? So they're waffling back and forth between one idea and the next. Like, oh, yeah, I do want that, and then I don't want it. The king at first, again, this is where you can tell that the king is not a true revolutionary, right? The king does not really want things to change that much. Is that he's essentially almost against right away the idea that the third estate would have any more power. And so at first he says, no, and so he rejects both things, individual votes and the third estate. And then when he thinks something's going to go wrong, he switches. He goes, oh, okay, actually, yeah, we will give you doubling the vote. Right? It's a typical politician thing, right? I'm going to say this, and then I realize none of you agree with me, so then I'm going to change my mind. That's called waffling, and that's exactly what the king does. Unfortunately, it's too late. As we'll see in just a second. So he first says no, realizing that he's made a mistake. He then changes his mind, and all of a sudden, okay, I am okay with doubling the third. However, by waffling, he essentially made enough of the leaders of the third estate angry that the third estate just gets up and leaves the Estates General. So now they've left it in limbo, like nothing can happen now. The third estate representatives just pick up and leave the Estates General. Yeah, so one of those times that had the king had some more backbone, and the king had said, okay, doubling the third, maybe the French Revolution would have never happened. But because he doesn't have a backbone or doesn't see what's happening fully, the fact that he says no first and makes enough people mad before he says yes has tipped the scales, and the third estate just leaves the Estates General. They then go to this image here on the right, and this is literal. The French liked to play tennis in the 18th century. And so they had tennis courts. This is an indoor tennis court you can see on the right-hand side. And the Estates General, along with some representatives of the first and second estate who were on the side of the third estate. So again, there are people in the first and second estate who agree that things need to change drastically. And so they side with the third estate against the king. They go over to this tennis court, and there on June 20th, 1789, this is oftentimes viewed as the moment that the French Revolution began. They make something that's called the tennis court oath, and I'll describe some things in that tennis court oath. But you have to take that literally. They're on a tennis court, and you can see that guy in the middle making an oath. June 20th, 1789 is oftentimes viewed as the beginning of the French Revolution. And there, the third estate, with again some supporters from the first and second estate, created, essentially out of thin air, a new government in France. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but remember, the American Revolution just happened, right? Americans just kicked their king off the throne and started a whole new country. Right? So this is not like unprecedented at this point. At this point, they don't kick the king off the throne. What they do is they get rid of the Estates General, essentially, and create a new legislative body. It's called the National Assembly. So they just flat out leave the Estates General and say, we're going to do our own thing over here. And together, they form this thing called the National Assembly. And the stated goal in the National Assembly is to write a new constitution for France. Maybe the first constitution for France, really. Lots of laws in France, but remember, the Americans have just written their constitution. And so there's a movement towards creating a constitution. Yes? It's sympathizers as well. Yeah, the National Assembly is going to be more democratic than the Estates General were. It's going to start removing some of this old world first, second, and third estate divisions. Yeah. The king hasn't agreed to it just yet, so it's like there's two things simultaneously going on. It's like the king thinks he's living in this old world where he's still in charge and the Estates General is going to be in charge. Then you have this other group over here that said, nope, actually this new National Assembly is going to be the government of France, and we're going to form a French constitution. And it takes a while, but the king eventually does relent. A week later, he realizes that he cannot oppose the sheer amount of will towards the National Assembly. Maybe he thought he could appease these people and they would come back. He could give them doubling the third. Maybe he could even give them individual votes, but these people had said, no, you decided not to give us what we wanted. And so now they realize, again, this leverage that they have over the king and the old world. And so when the king finally recognizes the National Assembly, the Estates General finally dissolves as well, which is a big moment because, again, the Estates General in many ways represented the old world of France, the medieval world. And so when it dissolved, it's like they just recognized that they were living in a new political landscape. By saying this new National Assembly is actually going to be the government, and the Estates General, the medieval legislation, now no longer exists. Now we're in a new French world. And so after the Tennis Court Oath, the National Assembly became the highest power in France. Again, somewhat overnight. I mean, a week is not that long, right, for the old world to end and the new world to begin. The problem is that nobody's really going to agree what this new world should look like. This is one of the strange instances in which you see the American Revolution, and the Americans seem to have coalesced around some pretty clear ideas. The French are not going to coalesce. They are going to have some very strong differences about what this new world should look like. So now the National Assembly has pushed out the Estates General, has in many ways boxed in the king. It's essentially started to sort of whittle away at the king's power. And then around the same time, we started to see some popular revolts. In other words, revolts by the people of France. The Estates General and the National Assembly is the government, right? Here we actually started to see some popular revolts amongst the everyday people of the French world. Perhaps one of the most famous is something called the storming of. However, in the revolution, it was no longer used as a castle, but it was actually used as a jail and as an ammunition depot. And it wasn't even that big of a jail. They only ever had a few prisoners at any given time. And so they oftentimes actually just, stored a bunch of ammo there, right? Literally guns, gunpowder, cannons, all that sort of stuff in the Bastille. So it represented the old world, but it really had just been used sort of as a makeshift prison and makeshift ammunition storage at the time of the revolution. However, there were rumors developing. That at the beginning of the revolution, that the king was going to take all that ammunition and start to use it against the National Assembly and against the revolutionaries. Scholars still try to discern whether this was true or not. It seems like the consensus has moved that this is just a rumor, that the king actually was not intending to fight back against the revolutionaries. But who cares? The practicality is they thought, at least enough people thought, he was going to go and take all that ammunition and use it against his own people. And so, members of the third estate, and again, I'm going to keep using that term just to recognize who we're talking about. Members of the third estate essentially went to the Bastille and requested these arms themselves to ensure that the king could not gain access to it. So again, you can think about this big group of members of the third estate surrounding the Bastille and asking for these arms, right? That they could take control of all these arms. Go ahead, Nick. Sorry, before I keep going.
So they're requesting for continue.
Yeah, that's okay.
Who was protecting it that they had to request that they're not part of the state talking about them like this?
Yeah. So the king is still in charge of the Bastille itself, and then there is a governor who is, maybe we would say like a prison warden or something like that. Somebody who's actually in charge of the Bastille itself who reports to the king. Does that make sense? So it's a representative of the king who's still in charge of it. Yeah, good question. And that person is going to make a really bad mistake. Because for some reason, and again, some of this is hard to disentangle completely, the governor fires shots at that crowd of people. Again, I feel like it's the same thing when we were talking about the massacre at the Great Temple with the Aztecs. It's like, what was really happening in this moment? Did this governor actually feel like his life was threatened, and so then asked, for the soldiers to essentially fire on a rowdy crowd? Was the crowd just using their voice and the governor reacted, or was the governor himself who's like, who cares? These are just peasants, and fires. You can't totally tell exactly what the choice being made here. But when he fired upon the crowd then stormed the Bastille. They literally pushed their way into the Bastille and conquered it, for lack of a better term. Now again, at this point, the Bastille is not actually that important of a location. It just has a few people in it who are in jail. It obviously has armaments, but it's not the only place that the king has arms, right? He doesn't hold all of his guns and cannons in the Bastille. But the moment itself is very much a symbolic moment of the revolution. Essentially, the peasants are now using their collective voice and storming this fortress that represents the old world. The world of the three estates of entrenched hierarchy. And now the peasants, the third estate essentially, are in charge of this great medieval castle. And so again, in the context, it's not that big of a moment in terms of what they've conquered. They didn't conquer some hugely strategic place. Again, the king has other places that he holds his guns and his army. It's the symbolic moment, oftentimes pointed to as a piece of major cultural change in terms of the revolution. In addition, we started to see revolts in the countryside against the old world of France as well. In France, again, they were still very much living in a medieval world in France. Most people were still farmers out in the middle of nowhere. Many of those people were still reliant upon the medieval manorial system, where like a local, again, maybe member of the second estate, a local noble, owned this great house, a chateau, this great house, and around that chateau were farms in which peasants farmed the land. Much of France was still in that very medieval world. And so one of the ways that the peasants in the countryside revolted was just to flat out burn down the noble manors. Like again, think about it symbolically, it's just to say, here is the thing that has represented our lives and generations of peasants' lives in France, and just removing them right, from the countryside altogether, right, just burning them down. Oh yeah, sorry, Gene. Yeah, again, you think about like the poorest farmers of the Third Estate. Remember, the Third Estate can be very diverse, very rich people. These are people living out in the countryside who have just been peasant farmers. And as the revolution kicks up, for them, the Bastille is not that big symbol, right? Maybe they've never even been to Paris. Their big symbol is the manor house that them and generations of their family have been living under, for hundreds of years. Exactly. Contextual ways of fighting it. Yep. And so for them, it's that manor house that the farm has always been attached to, that you have to give taxes to. And maybe your family for generations has been loyal, but haven't gotten that much back from the duke or the baron or whatever that person calls himself. And so they revolt by literally burning down those symbols of the old world. They also start to do, again, things that we saw in the American Revolution, right? It's to essentially form militias, like local protective armies, utilizing things that maybe some of those manors actually stashed. Again, maybe those manors themselves also stashed ammunition and arms. And so they began to confiscate that and to create kind of their own rural militias to protect themselves from any rumors about what the king may or may not do. Again, it's always hard to tell whether these things are rumors or whether they actually believe, like they had credible evidence that the king was going to fight back. The result is the same. Whether it was true or not, it resulted in the forming of these militias, right? These local armies of people who are going to protect themselves against whomever wants to invade or to put a stop to their changes. And then one of the big moments as well that comes a little bit later on is what's called the October Days. Okay, depicted here. You can see this group pulling this cannon. Anybody tell what connects all of these people in this group? Sorry? Okay. They're all women, that's right. All women pulling this cannon. One of the things about the October Days is that as you can tell, in October, in 1789, a group of Third Estate women, mostly Third Estate women, actually stormed the Palace of Versailles. That's where the king actually lives, that great palace that Louis XIV had built during his reign. And you can see they were fairly well armed in their storming of the Versailles. Of Versailles. Their major issue, or what they were really trying to get out of the king, is the recognition that bread prices are astronomical at this point. That the government essentially must step in to do something about bread prices continuing to skyrocket. When the king said, "I don't care," essentially, women were saying, bread prices are skyrocketing, and the king said, "I can't do anything about it," they decided to storm Versailles. So this was their moment in which women were very dissatisfied with the response that the king gave in 1789 to their concerns about skyrocketing bread prices. Again, 50 to 80% of your income going to bread. Something that should almost be at the very bottom of the food chain in many ways, literally. We're not talking about meat or some, like sugar or chocolate or something like that that's only for the upper class. This is bread, something that peasants have been eating for generations. And when they do, the king had kind of taken a step back in many ways, and in the October Days when these women stormed Versailles, they actually brought the king back out of hiding, essentially. The king had to come back into the fold and begin to negotiate again with the revolutionaries. So at the very least, what the October days illustrated was that there was a lot of dissatisfaction across the third estate. And that people who had traditionally perhaps not had a huge amount of power in the past now also began to leverage that power. And they were able to bring the king back into the negotiating table. The king had essentially said, okay, you have the National Assembly. Now I don't care about your revolution, perhaps. But things continued to get worse and worse. And in the October days, these women were able to bring him essentially out of hiding in Versailles. Versailles is actually somewhat far outside of Paris, and even farther in a world where you don't have trains. And so bringing him out of Versailles is kind of literal. Like, you need to come back to Paris and you need to start negotiating with the National Assembly about how to fix all of these issues in the economy. That same year, and you can tell 1789, big year for the French. That same year, in 1789, the National Assembly created essentially its first constitution of France, described as the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Again, putting that in context, the American Constitution had been ratified a couple of years earlier. And then this same year, 1789 actually for the American Constitution is also the year that it's essentially finalized in many ways. So they're coming about the same time actually that the American Constitution is sort of finalized by all of the states. That's usually the date we give as well, as 1789. And then we have the Bill of Rights that comes 2 years later in 1791. So again, this is coming kind of in that same time, and maybe a little bit ahead of the United States now in terms of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the United States. And similar to our Constitution, it's viewed essentially as a charter of liberties. Again, this is a very Lockean, Enlightenment way to think about government, right, in an 18th century world. Naming the liberties that are given under the National Assembly. And they sound very familiar to the American Bill of Rights as well. One is it gave freedom of speech. Especially against things like, remember I was talking about the Stamp Act in America that led to the American Revolution, and thinking about the stamp that goes on paper. In many ways, freedom of speech is really about that. Essentially, does the king have to approve what you say on paper or in print, things like that as well. So again, our Charter of Liberties has freedom of the press specifically stated. This one, in many ways, kind of has that within it as well. It's not just I can go out and say things, but then also I can publish things, because that's a part of speech as well as what can be published. So you may not need the stamp of the king any longer to be able to publish under these new rights and liberties, right? This Charter of Liberties. It also enshrined religious toleration, right? So this idea since Louis XIV of one king, one law, one faith, that now goes by the wayside according to the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It doesn't totally displace the Catholic Church, though. And again, this might be the difference between the American Constitution and this Constitution at this point. Again, we'll see the French go even wilder in a few minutes, but the American Constitution any longer. People like Voltaire have to be able to say what they need to say. Minorities need to be able to worship somewhat freely. Yes, that's right, more access than just the Catholic Church. And I do use toleration because that's very much what they mean. They don't have like this idea again of like religious plurality where everybody can be right or something like that. They think you're wrong, and toleration just means that you just have to tolerate other people. You're still wrong, but I'm going to tolerate you. Yeah. This is not like religious freedom necessarily, or like, again, a sort of modern egalitarianism in terms of religion or something like that. It's very much, well, we're going to tolerate all you people even if we think what you think is crazy. Yeah. Again, in a very Lockean view, is that property is a natural right. A right that you have in your being just by being a human being. Said being 50 times. Just by being human, you have the right to own property. Again, it's a very Lockean Enlightenment view that the United States also views as more or less a natural right at the same time that the Declaration of the Rights of Man also enshrines. It also passes sovereignty, right? We can see at the beginning of this class, I talked about sovereignty, right? But totally around the king. He rules over all. And remember, kings, at the beginning of our class, were kings of geography. If you're in my borders, then I am your king and you are my subjects. The table's now been flipped. Sovereignty rests in the people, not in the monarch. That doesn't mean necessarily that you get rid of your monarch, but that power vests in the people, not in the monarch. And the people can dissolve the monarch if necessary. Yeah.
So, what do they want the monarch to do if they didn't have any monarch?
Well, it's more of like they have had monarchs now for so many hundreds of years that in many ways rejecting a monarch is like rejecting civilized society. So even in England they have kings and queens still, right, even to today. But King Charles has no power at all today. King Charles III could not do anything. If King Charles said one thing about legislation, it could cause a constitutional crisis. But they still have monarchs. Because there's just some like deep-seated aspect of culture that says that civilized societies have monarchs. Not everybody, as we'll see, not everybody is going to share that view in just a second. But revolution doesn't almost ever entail getting rid of your king. Again, the Americans are very strange in just saying no king, but our executive office, like if you read the Constitution, it actually sounds very much like what a king does, but without that title and without the hereditary part. You elect that person, but the executive branch is very similar in the original Constitution to what kings were doing in the late 1700s. So we do sort of have a king, it's just that we elect that person and it's term limited. The executive branch is essentially what kings were expected to do, like run the military, commanders-in-chief, essentially. That's pretty much directly from English monarchs into the American system. They might have last say in terms of judicial laws, like somebody going through the courts. The king might be the last person that you could appeal to, so like a Supreme Court of some type. There might be an expectation that Louis would still be the representation of religion, giving an aspect of virtue to the people. So there's some ceremonial and some things like, again, leadership of the army, final say, and judicial review. They might be able to veto laws. So again, similar to honestly the way that the American executive office is supposed to run according to the Constitution. But we'll keep the king, and you can still, pass it on to your kids, all that sort of stuff, because that's the way it's always been. Question? Now, one of the things that's very different than the way you and I think about citizenship today is that the Declaration of the Rights of Man differentiated between two different types of citizens called active and passive citizens. So although it's expanding rights, there was a differentiation between an active and a passive citizen. So what's an active citizen? Well, an active citizen is a person who had paid a certain amount of taxes and therefore gained some extra rights because of the tax threshold that they had met. So when they say active, what they mean is somebody that's essentially really active in the economy, right? Somebody who's producing for France. Because of that, that person is paying a certain amount of tax, And when they reach that level of being an active citizen, then they are able to hold office and to vote. So this is substantial. You had to get to a certain economic status, even under this new declaration, to be able to hold an office, so to run for a government position or to be a judge, and then to actually vote, you had to reach that certain status. Otherwise, you fell into a passive citizen, in which case you only retained your natural rights, which are still pretty robust under the Declaration. But it essentially tried to incentivize people working and paying taxes. And when you did that, you gained a certain level of voting rights and could hold office. So there is some level, and I think this is something that's important to note about the Enlightenment, is that the Enlightenment very much viewed humans on a hierarchy still. And again, this is even in our own American Constitution, that the Founding Fathers of America very much believed that educated, rich landowners were superior than essentially the poor of society. And the French, even though they're becoming more egalitarian sort of overall, also had this view that you needed to be at a certain level to be able to be given the vote and to be given leadership in this new revolutionary empire, or nation, not empire. And that's very much a part of the Enlightenment, yeah. Oh, I don't know, I'm sorry. You guys love your stats. I feel like I need it before class. I need to look up all these stats. I don't know, I'm sorry. Is it a stats question? Because I don't know. Okay. Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So it's more about the second thing that you just said, and I know many of you couldn't hear her, so I'll say that again. That it's incentivizing people to essentially become a certain economic level, like to become richer, so that they can pay a certain amount of tax and then be given this extra set of rights. So like our tax system is progressive right now as well, right? The less money you make, the fewer percentage of that you get taxed. It's kind of like that, where you want to grow up the scale, you'll become richer, but then your tax bracket will go up, and once you reach a certain tax bracket, then you become an active citizen. You get more rights that come with that. Yeah, that's the difference between ours, is that in the law, you don't get more rights because of your tax bracket. Yeah, at least that's not the way it's supposed to work. Yeah. Here, it's enshrined. That is the way it's supposed to work. Good question. So they're moving away from the old regime, the old way, the medieval world, and moving towards a modern one. Let's take our break right now before I keep going. So we'll come back 1252. Declaration of the Rights of Man. The National Assembly keeps pushing further and further against the old regime, the old world of France. And one of the things that they begin to push back on, which has mixed results, at least in terms of the everyday people, is the National Assembly begins to whittle away at the Catholic Church's power in France. In 1789, again that same year, the National Assembly began to confiscate the property of the Catholic Church. Remember, I mentioned last week that the Catholic Church was the single largest landholder in France, even more than what the king owned. And so the National Assembly essentially started to nationalize the land that the Catholic Church owned. And then the next year, in 1790, they essentially created a constitution specifically for what was called the First Estate, right? The clergy of France. And this is more of a limiting document. This is not really a constitution in the liberty granting side. This is a limiting document. First is that the Catholic Church in France was going to be under state authority. In other words, essentially the National Assembly would run and regulate the Catholic Church in France. So, yeah, essentially run and regulate the Catholic Church in France. Not across the whole Catholic world, but in France. Alongside that, the clergy had to swear allegiance to the state. I've mentioned this a few times across our semester, but one of the issues with Catholicism across the board, and definitely in revolutionary France, is that they always have the Pope out there to whom they have to give some version of allegiance. The Pope, as the leader of universal Catholicism, they have to give some version of allegiance to that person like a quasi-king. Here, they're essentially telling the clergy that they need to make an oath of allegiance to the French state, that they will be loyal to the French state if they want to remain as clergy. As we talked about last week, oaths make a lot of difference. Oaths are really meaningful to people in the 18th century. And to clergy people, like to priests, this would be especially meaningful because you're making an oath before God that you will be faithful to the French king, or the French government in this instance, not the king, but the government of France. So that's a substantial ask that they have to do. They have to swear allegiance to France. And the French state is now going to pay the clergy's salaries. This is not going to come, remember, previously the church would just grant the king essentially some taxes, but they gained their wealth from tithing across France, and probably were being paid, most of them, by the church more broadly. Now salaries are going to come from the state. So there's more leverage that the secular government is going to have over the priests and the bishops in France. And in many ways, a lot of these laws were set up to limit the Pope's power in France during the Revolution. So in many ways, these laws were not necessarily against the church, but against the Pope's power in France. They know that the Pope can still manipulate world events, not in a bad way, but he can say things that will impact the way that people and kings work. And so they're trying to avoid that contested issue and make sure that the clergy are loyal to France first. Somebody have a hand up? Let me see. Yeah, go ahead.
These are the three first points that are just like things they want to change, and
Yeah.
the last point is the overall why they're doing it.
Yeah, why they're doing it, yep. So the first 3 points are essentially what they're changing, and then this last one here is kind of the underlying thing that it's really trying to deal with is the Pope's power within revolutionary France. Not necessarily getting rid of the church at this point, although they're about to do that. That may not be the goal at this point. It's more, again, to make France and its people sovereign, not the king or some quasi-king like the Pope. These laws were perhaps the most divisive of the early revolution. People seemed to like their local parish priest actually pretty well. Many early revolutionaries didn't actually want to touch religion all that much. Maybe a little bit here or there. Again, maybe the church doesn't need to own all of this property, maybe. But this idea of the priests kind of abandoning their oath to the papacy, that actually rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, even people that were pro-revolution. This almost moved into an area that many French people believed that the revolution should not enter into. The revolution should deal with secular issues like taxes and the monarchy, bread prices, right? All those things we talked about. The revolution should not deal with the church. That's a different realm altogether. So this was extremely divisive. Maybe could have led to some things falling off the rails at this point, but it keeps going. And again, this illustrates that in the revolutionary periods, Religion has this really strange role to play in the overall scheme of revolutions. Again, the American Revolution does not reject religion, but it does reject institutional religion. And the French are kind of moving along in that degree as well, but they're not rejecting religion altogether. And they're not necessarily wanting the secular forces to overstep their boundaries into the world of the church. But when they do, it proves as very divisive. It's extremely divisive amongst the clergy, right? Amongst the actual priests themselves. Many of them view that as breaking their oath to the church to make an oath to the state. And then making things even worse, the Pope says to clergy that do this that they will be excommunicated if they follow through with what the French revolutionaries want. Remember, the church always has that extra hand to play, which is whether you're going to heaven or hell when you die. And at this point, the Pope uses that leverage and essentially says to Catholic clergy, if you swear an oath to the state, you will be excommunicated from the church, which means, in their view, that you're going to hell. And so he does try to essentially push this even farther, causing more division in France. So maybe the National Assembly went too far in this. Now the Pope is pushed back and maybe he's going too far again. And so things are starting to pick up and maybe move beyond what any original revolutionaries wanted to happen. And then Louis makes a really terrible choice. When all of this stuff is building up, Louis XVI, the current king, who again is still on the throne, attempts to flee France. Literally tries to escape his own country and go to his father-in-law's house, because his father-in-law at this point is, his brother-in-law is the Holy Roman Emperor. This is a huge mistake on his part. So he had tried to escape to Austria. And no joke, like and this is Marie Antoinette, I forget who mentioned that. Was it you, Nick? Yeah, from last time. Marie Antoinette, the famous queen, but they tried to escape to Austria, and they didn't really even try to hide that they were doing this, which was really dumb. Again, you can kind of see if they were kind of arrogant, like, this is our country, yes, we're going to escape, but nobody's going to stop us. They apparently stopped for hours and had these great banquets on their way to Austria. It's like, if you're fleeing the country, don't stop and have a great banquet on the side of the road that's going to tell everybody, who's that over there? Like, who are those people that just rented out this entire tavern all of a sudden and have all this retinue and all of these bureaucrats following them? That seems a little bit strange. But that's exactly what they do. And they are caught at the border, and Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are put in prison. This made the revolutionaries, maybe they were waiting for an excuse to do this anyways, but this made the revolutionaries suspicious of the king. Because it seemed like Louis was going to go off to Austria and hand over France to his brother-in-law. It seemed like maybe Louis was going to, in many ways, allow the Holy Roman Emperor to then invade France. What was Louis's goal in escaping to Austria, of all places, where the Holy Roman Emperor still resides and is very ambitious? So this turned the tide against Louis XVI. Again, a huge mistake on his part. And when he does this, the National Assembly actually declares war on Austria and Prussia. This causes essentially all of Europe to turn against the French Revolution. This is where things are finally going off the rails in many ways. All the other nations around them are looking at what the French are doing and viewing this as a net negative for Europe, for France, and many nations start to turn against the French Revolution. Now, however, all of these different revolutionary factions in France, all these people fighting for different types of rights and privileges, they all need to unify now. And again, this is what causes another stage to begin. And it's, I can't hear you. So, like England, Prussia, Austria, Spain, even to a degree the United States, all view, because this war is about to begin again, they actually view the changes in France as being detrimental to the future of Europe. That's what I mean. Even if it had some good things that were going to change, because of this movement where they're now against the king, against Austria, against Prussia, it turned Europe more broadly against this revolution. Yeah, they saw France, that's a good way to put it. They saw France's actions as now being detrimental to Europe as a whole. And even the United States, that just had their own revolution, is looking at this and saying this is kind of going beyond even what they had done. And it's going to get even worse, of course, in just a second. Does that help, Nancy? Yeah, questions? But oh yeah, I'm sorry. No, please.
So who were attempting to unify revolution?
Yeah, I was going to repeat that right now, yeah. So the aftermath of that meant that when all of Europe turns against the French, the factions within France, all these different groups who are fighting for more freedom, they were very disparate, right? You might be trying to get bread prices down, you might be getting taxes down, you might be working against the clergy. Now France as a revolutionary nation had to unify around the revolution because everybody else is against them. So in some ways, as Europe turns against France, these inner factions in France had to solidify towards a goal that was clearer than the first phases of the revolution. And some people take over that become really intense. Does that help? Maybe, again, maybe ask a question as I keep going if it doesn't really make as much sense as you need. Because the group that comes into play to unify the French in the French Revolution were probably the most detrimental in the long run, and they are called the Jacobins. There's still an American, it's a pretty far left magazine that's called the Jacobins. You can subscribe to it if you'd like, based upon a lot of essentially the ethos of the Jacobins in the French Revolution. So who were they? The Jacobins were actually a French political club. Political parties are beginning to develop across the Western world. And in France, especially in Paris, you would actually meet essentially as a club of like-minded individuals pushing towards certain political reforms. And so the Jacobins were one of many different political clubs that had developed during the French Revolution. And the Jacobins had extensive membership throughout France. All right, so it wasn't just in Paris. Of course, you would meet with your club in Paris, but you might have different networks. Again, very similarly to the way a political party works today, where you might have local constituencies of either the Democrats or the Republicans in any individual area. The Jacobins had extensive political membership across all of France. And part of that is that they became somewhat, again, this is using more modern terms, but somewhat of a populist movement claiming to represent essentially everyday French people. So that when the National Assembly would hold elections, right, they would essentially go up like other political parties and run in the National Assembly elections. And they would use that they were the representatives of like everyday French people, right, as their kind of political platform. Now, again, I'm sorry, things are continuing to expand. Over time, France invented another legislative body. Again, similar to what we have, right? We have the Senate and the House of Representatives. The French invented another legislative body called the National Convention. Again, this government is somewhat evolving, again, trying to move on from just the revolutionary principles to be more of a legitimate and long-lasting body. So they have this new thing called the National Convention. And the Jacobins essentially were elected and pushed the National Convention to be more radical than the National Assembly had been. So again, you can kind of think about them as a populist party that had become more and more powerful over time. And then with the rise of this new thing called the National Convention, the Jacobins, claiming to represent the everyday people, were elected en masse and pushed the National Convention even more radical than the National Assembly had been. Edgy.
So what pretty much was this national convention? Because that's a legislative body, but like what did they do different to the national convention?
What did they do that was different than the National Assembly? Not much.
They're
Yeah.
just pretty much another piece of it.
Yeah, and then eventually the National Convention replaces the National Assembly. Yeah. This is, the French have revolted like 4 or 5 times, right? I think the republic that, William, Google, which republic are the French in right now? Is it the 5th? The French are very interesting in trying to come up with republics. Yeah, the 5th republic right now. We're still on our 1st here in America, and they're on their 5th. The French are definitely a trial and error country at this point. and they're getting better and better over time. But over time, the National Convention will just supplant the National Assembly. So for our intents and purposes, just pretend like they're the same thing, but a more radical version of it. So radical that finally, after a few years of all of this, they just finally did it and declared on September 21st, 1792, that France was a republic officially, and that they did not need a king any longer. Remember, the king is in jail. The Jacobins, again claiming to represent the everyday people, just finally did the last thing and say, we don't need a king, and declared France a republic, and then immediately put the king on trial. Again, people were already suspicious. They finally took the last step, put on trial for treason, right? Perhaps even thinking about giving away the nation to the Holy Roman Empire. And so, as depicted here, January of 1793, Louis XVI is beheaded in Paris. And you can see this new invention that has come into play that will become synonymous with this phase of the revolution. This thing over here that's called the guillotine. The guillotine, which I think I'll bring back a couple of times, I'm just thinking about it, but the guillotine is supposed to be the rational way to execute somebody. This is the enlightened version of execution, because it's a swift beheading. You don't even have to worry about the more difficult beheadings using a sword, which could become very complicated. And you're dead. So it was the rational way to execute somebody. And they used it on Louis XVI. And now, France has no king and is a republic. This is when the Jacobins keep going. We've already beheaded the king, may as well keep the revolution moving farther and farther, and perhaps in a more radical direction. They then decided to abolish Catholicism altogether. This is where the French Revolution again continues. Oh, I'm sorry, Isabella, I'm just yapping, please.
So obviously with all the army underneath the king.
Yeah.
So when it gets to the revolution, how that basically remains
Good question. Some people did remain loyal to the king. You'll see skirmishes of things like that, but the National Convention in many ways took the power away from the king, the power of the army away from the king. So you would have had to have generals and people in the army who were loyal to the revolutionary cause, which they did. Yeah, good question. So you have some that remained loyal, and that's what makes this even more difficult, for sure. But you had a lot of people who had gone to the revolutionary cause, including perhaps Napoleon, but we haven't got to him just yet. Good question. So the Jacobins go even farther and just abolish Catholicism in France. They do, again, some radical things like essentially saying dressing like you're a member of the clergy is illegal. You can't even look like you are a priest any longer. They start to remove imagery that's distinctly Christian in nature, which, as you can imagine, with 1,000 years of Christianity behind them, there's lots of images out there, right, on public buildings, in public spaces that are highly Christian. Many of those things start to come down, taking away the focus of the church out of the central part and towards just everyday life.
So is it still Protestant? Is it just not any of it?
It's no religion. Yeah, it's not Protestant. It's no religion. So they're trying to decenter Catholicism. That's what the idea of getting rid of these images are, is to decenter it in everyday life. Maybe you at your home might have your own little, your crosses, your rosaries, your crucifixes, but in public life, Christianity will be at the periphery. They did some kind of absurd things. They actually reorganized the calendar away from all of the Christian festivals and Christian orientation. The idea of, what does AD stand for? No. No. Yeah, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. AD means the year of our Lord in Latin. They got rid of that, and it's no longer 1792, but instead they're trying to avoid all of those sort of Christian things, because 1792 is organized around Jesus and the year of our Lord Jesus. They wanted to get rid of things that were part of everyday life, like the Christian Sabbath, the idea that you would take the seventh day off and rest or go to church. That's out the window. And like I said, 1792, instead of being called 1792, became year one. So when you see some of these calendars, they will do them simultaneously. They might say 1792 and year one of the revolution. It's almost like the calendar flipped over to a whole new calendar. Not based upon Jesus or any sort of Christian imagery or festivals, but instead around the revolution. Now, Ellie, maybe this answers your question a little bit more as well. Instead of being Catholic, instead of being Protestant, the Jacobins produced an Enlightenment version of Christianity, of religion, maybe more broadly, and called this the cult, which is the Latin term for essentially like religion, the cult of the supreme being. So it's not like they became atheists, but it's a very enlightened way of thinking that up there, right? Think about deism, and we talked about that in terms of Voltaire and these movements away from traditional Christianity, is that God's up there somewhere as this grand supreme being. But he usually doesn't interact with humans any longer. And if he does, it's through the rational mechanisms of the world. And so Notre Dame, that great cathedral, the medieval cathedral in Paris, became known as the Temple of Reason. So they even tried to essentially remove, in many ways, the what Notre Dame is, and rename it after this idea of rationality. You go to a place like Notre Dame, you don't worship superstition of Catholicism, but instead you can go there and worship human ingenuity, human rationalism. And so the Jacobins really pushed the revolution beyond anything that the early revolutionaries wanted to happen. And again, this is making them, in many ways, somewhat embarrassing in the eyes of other nations around them. I'm not saying they're actually embarrassing, but this is what makes, again, the English, the Spanish, the Americans even, think this is beyond what civilized culture should do. You might decenter religion, but to make it illegal and then have this strange cult of reason, enlightened societies don't do that. And then the Jacobins become even more intense in a period that we now refer to as the Reign of Terror, right? It's going to be really exciting. Many people did not agree with the changes that the Jacobins were making. For many, they had gone way too far. Beheading a king is a really intense thing to do. And many French people might have wanted a republic in some way, but not a beheading of the king, not a decentering of Catholicism. And so in order to ensure that these reforms would take place, the Jacobins began to use essentially emergency powers against France. So the revolution has gone beyond, and now the revolutionaries are the dictators. Yeah.
So you said the revolution has gone beyond the revolutionaries, now it's just named the Jacobins?
Yeah. And they start using emergency powers to essentially consolidate all the power around themselves. Maybe powers that are only supposed to be used in extensive war times, right? Maybe where a government has collapsed because of war, then you do emergency powers, but they're using it to push through the reforms that most people don't agree with. Ensuring that they can consolidate power and push the revolution farther and more radical. To ensure that this takes place, they form a committee called the Committee of Public Safety. This is oftentimes what dictatorships do, right? Is they come up with a committee that sounds very nice, and then underneath it, they're like killing people, right? So if you get a committee that sounds really nice, you should question it. The committee to keep everyone safe, right? And be like, okay, what do you mean? I felt safe already. So the Committee for Public Safety has all of this power vested within it. All right, just trying to keep the people safe. The reality is that the Committee of Public Safety is there to control the revolution, to guide the revolution now in a direction that the Jacobins believe that it needs to keep going. Scaring people, disappearing people, jailing people, and ensuring that people that speak against it are persecuted. And that's, of course, what they think public safety is, right? You need to be protected from these other people who are going to be putting bad things into your ears, right? Only the Committee for Public Safety can keep you protected from these others who are working against the committee. And so they start to round up people who are against them, particularly those people that might be pro-monarchy. Some people that might want to, in other words, place another king on the throne. And some scholars argue that many of the people during this time essentially viewed the ruthlessness of it as actually a virtue. That these tactics were worth it because of what it was producing in revolutionary France. It seems very strange because in the post-Enlightenment world, these sorts of things are supposed to be done with. We're not supposed to do these things after rationality has kicked in. That's a leftover of the superstitious world of the Middle Ages. Rational people don't do these types of things anymore. But in many ways, the Jacobins essentially rationalized it by arguing for its virtue towards the greater good of society. This is going to put an end to thought that may be harmful to you, everyday citizen.
So, you said that ruthlessness is a virtue, you can look at that like, there's the Jacobins thought that this was good for reproducing.
Yeah. They thought this was a good thing that they were doing. Again, how much they just kind of deluded themselves into thinking that is up for debate. But they viewed this as a good thing for society. They recognized that it might be very ruthless. In other words, what they're doing might be really painful. It might require some things that may look immoral at first, but underneath it, it's better for society. And for about a 2-year period, the Jacobins, under the Reign of Terror and the Committee of Public Safety, produced mass executions throughout France. Some 40,000 people throughout France. And again, they used the rational, effective, and efficient way of just lining them all up and one by one sending them to the guillotine. It's quick and effective, and it's rational. This is what rational people do when they kill 40,000 people in a 2-year period, is they put their heads into the guillotine. They also, in many ways, because of this, put an end to the old world. Because of those 40,000, almost half were like official. So, actually, let me put it this way. Almost half were done by the state, and then the other half were done like in that secretive way. So 40,000 people are executed, but only about half are done in public. Right? So you can think about the scariness when is that the right number, 24,000? To equal 40,000? 24,000 people are just like disappeared, and you never see them again. Or murdered in their sleep. So you can think about just how scary that might be for this 2-year period, hence why scholars oftentimes refer to this period as the Terror. Yeah. That's a great question. It's not the hugest ratio. I think France is probably 20 million? Does that make sense? No, that doesn't make sense actually. So California is at 30 million right now, right? I don't know. Google it. Somebody Google it. I feel like I'm going to guess my way into ignorance. France in 1800. Oh, okay. See, I second guessed myself. All right, 28 million. So, not the huge ratio. I don't know what that ratio is. 40,000 is still a lot of people. But you know, it's not like every other person is being disappeared. But this is when the revolution went off the rails. The Jacobins, again, pushing it farther than it had ever gone, behead the king, push against the traditions, and institute something that's just supposed to protect you, good revolutionary citizen, and literally executes the old world of France, utilizing the guillotine, the rational way of executing your enemies. And that was supposed to bring about a lasting revolution. What it's really going to bring about is this guy called Napoleon. But we'll talk about him on Thursday. Stick around if you have questions.